My name is Father Thomas, and I'm 58 years old. I've served as a Catholic priest in various parishes across the United States for over 30 years. I've heard thousands of confessions, performed countless baptisms and funerals, and I thought I understood the nature of good and evil. But what I discovered in St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco in October 2017 taught me that evil can hide in the most sacred places, waiting patiently for centuries to be found. There are things that can't be explained. What I experienced that night changed everything. I had been assigned to St. Mary's as part of a team overseeing major renovations. The cathedral, built in the 1970s, needed significant structural work, but the renovation also included the crypt beneath the main sanctuary, a space that had been largely neglected for decades. The crypt contained tombs of former bishops and prominent Catholics from San Francisco's history. My role was primarily spiritual, blessing the work sites and ensuring that any human remains were treated with proper respect and dignity. I didn't expect to be involved in anything unusual. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, combining my pastoral duties with my interest in church history. Everything changed when the construction crew was excavating a section of the crypt to install new drainage systems. They found something that wasn't on any architectural plans: a sealed chamber hidden behind what everyone had assumed was a solid wall. The stones blocking it had been mortared so skillfully that the seam was almost invisible. The foreman, a man named Rodriguez, who had been doing church construction for 20 years, called me down immediately. He said something about the chamber felt wrong. His crew was nervous, some of them refusing to go near the wall after they'd broken through the first layer of stone. I went down to see for myself. The moment I stepped into that section of the crypt, I felt it, a wrongness in the air, a heaviness that made breathing difficult. The temperature was noticeably colder than the rest of the crypt, cold enough that I could see my breath forming clouds in the beam of my flashlight. We carefully removed more stones, creating an opening large enough to enter. I went in first, holding my crucifix and praying under my breath. The chamber was small, maybe 10 feet square. The walls were covered in writing, scratched directly into the stone, not prayers or scripture. These were symbols I recognized from my studies of church history, from the sections dealing with heresies and occult practices that the church had fought against throughout the centuries. In the center of the chamber was an altar, not a Christian altar. This was something else entirely. The stone was black, a type I didn't recognize, and it was covered in stains that I preferred not to think about. Around the altar, someone had arranged bones in specific patterns, human bones, arranged with deliberate purpose according to rituals that had nothing to do with Christianity. Rodriguez came in behind me and immediately backed out, crossing himself repeatedly. He said he'd been in a lot of old churches, seen a lot of strange things, but nothing like this. The space felt occupied, he said, like something was watching us, waiting to see what we'd do. I called the Archbishop immediately. This was beyond anything I could handle alone. He arrived within hours, bringing with him an expert in church history from the local Catholic university. What they told me was deeply troubling. Based on the symbols and the arrangement, this chamber appeared to date from the late 1800s. San Francisco had a dark period then, when the city was growing rapidly and lawlessness was common. There had been rumors of satanic cults operating in the city, but most historians dismissed them as moral panic and anti-Catholic propaganda. But this chamber suggested the rumors might have had some truth. Someone, or a group of people, had built this space beneath what would later become the cathedral. They had performed rituals here, ceremonies that inverted and mocked Christian rites. The bones suggested sacrifices, though whether animal or human would require forensic analysis. the most disturbing part was the writing on the walls. According to the expert, it was a mixture of corrupted Latin and symbols from various occult traditions, but one phrase was repeated over and over, carved deep into the stone. Translated roughly, it meant, "We open the door. We call what waits. We bind it here." If you're enjoying this, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like these. And tell me in the comments what story you want to hear next. Whatever they had been trying to do in this chamber, they believed they were opening a connection to something, summoning something, and binding it to this location. The Archbishop's face was grave as he explained this. He said we needed to perform an exorcism, not of a person, but of the place itself. That night, we performed the ritual. The Archbishop, myself, and 2 other priests spent 4 hours in that chamber, praying, blessing every surface with holy water, burning incense, reciting the rites of exorcism. It was the most spiritually exhausting experience of my life. During the ritual, things happened that I struggle to explain. The candles we brought flickered and went out repeatedly, despite there being no wind. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the stone walls. We heard sounds, voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves, whispering in languages I didn't recognize. At one point, I felt something push against me, a physical force that nearly knocked me over. The other priests felt it too. It was as if something in that chamber didn't want us there, was fighting against our prayers, our attempt to cleanse the space. But we persisted. We prayed for hours until finally, gradually, the oppressive feeling began to lift. The temperature returned to normal. The whispers faded. The Archbishop performed a final blessing, and we sealed the chamber again, this time with concrete and a layer of blessed stones. Before we sealed it completely, we placed a large cross of iron blessed by the Archbishop inside the chamber. We also left a written record of what we found and what we did in case someone in the future discovers the chamber again. Future generations need to know what lies beneath that cathedral, what was once practiced there. The Archbishop ordered that all records of the incident be sealed in the diocesan archives. He didn't want to cause panic or give publicity to what had been done in that chamber, but he made sure that certain people, including myself and future leaders of the cathedral, would know the truth. I still serve at St. Mary's. I say Mass in the sanctuary above that sealed chamber every week, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the cathedral. I can feel it. A presence, faint but still there, watching from beneath the floor. Whatever was bound there by those rituals over a century ago, I don't think it's truly gone. I think it's waiting, patient as only eternal things can be. But Father Thomas's experience isn't unique in the world of American churches. In fact, I recently spoke with Margaret, a 44-year-old church organist from New Orleans, Louisiana. What she experienced at St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter shows that sometimes the most innocent-seeming elements of a church can harbor the darkest secrets. Her story involves something that most of us take for granted in churches, the music that fills these sacred spaces. Margaret has been playing organ and piano in New Orleans churches for over 20 years. Music is her life, her calling, the way she serves God. In June 2018, she accepted a position at St. Louis Cathedral, one of the oldest and most famous churches in the United States, right in the heart of the French Quarter. The cathedral is magnificent, with its iconic white spires visible from all over the quarter. Inside, it's equally impressive, with beautiful stained glass, ornate decorations, and a pipe organ that dates back to the 1850s. Margaret was thrilled to have the opportunity to play such a historic instrument. Her duties included playing for Mass, weddings, and funerals, as well as maintaining the organ and practicing regularly to keep her skills sharp. She often stayed late into the evening, long after the cathedral had closed, practicing in the peaceful silence. It was during one of these late practice sessions that she first noticed something strange. She was working on a Bach fugue, a complex piece that required intense concentration. But as she played, she began to hear something else, another melody, very faint, weaving in and out of the notes she was playing. At first, she thought it was just an acoustic quirk of the cathedral. The space has unusual acoustics due to its age and architecture. But the more she listened, the more convinced she became that this wasn't an echo or a harmonic overtone. It was an actual melody being played on an instrument she couldn't see. Margaret stopped playing. The phantom melody continued for a few seconds longer, then faded away. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. She sat there, hands hovering over the keys, listening intently. Nothing. Just the ambient sounds of an old building settling. She tried to dismiss it and went back to practicing, but every time she played certain passages, especially those with minor keys and low bass notes, the phantom melody would return. It was always the same tune, haunting and melancholy, with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Curious and somewhat unsettled, Margaret began researching the history of the cathedral's organ. She learned that it had been rebuilt several times over its long life, but parts of the original mechanism from the 1850s were still incorporated into the current instrument. She also learned something disturbing. In 1862, during the Civil War, when Union forces occupied New Orleans, the cathedral's organist, a man named Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, had continued to play despite the occupation. He was known for his devotion to the cathedral and his exceptional skill. According to historical accounts, Rousseau played a final recital on a Sunday evening in April 1862, and the next morning he was found dead at the organ bench. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but some accounts suggested it was more mysterious. Margaret found a journal entry from a priest who had served at the cathedral during that time. He wrote that Rousseau had become obsessed with a particular melody, one he claimed came to him in dreams. The priest's journal suggested that the melody was unsettling and not suitable for God's house, but Rousseau insisted on playing it, saying it was the most important piece he'd ever composed. The priest's journal suggested that Rousseau died while playing this very melody, collapsing over the keys during what witnesses described as the most beautiful and terrible music they'd ever heard. Some who were present claimed the cathedral itself seemed to resonate with the music, as if the building was responding to something in the melody. Margaret wondered if the phantom tune she was hearing was Rousseau's lost composition. She decided to try an experiment. One night, alone in the cathedral, she attempted to play along with the phantom melody when it appeared. She improvised, matching the harmonies and rhythm as best she could. What happened next terrified her. As she played along with the invisible melody, the organ began to respond in ways it shouldn't. Keys she wasn't pressing moved on their own. Stops she hadn't pulled activated themselves. The music grew louder and more complex, as if the organ itself had come alive and was playing independently. And then she heard the voice. It came from the pipes of the organ, from the very instrument itself. It was singing words in French, words she didn't understand, but which filled her with inexplicable dread. The voice was beautiful and horrible at once, like something that should never have been given the ability to make sound. Margaret stopped playing immediately and ran from the organ loft. She didn't stop until she was outside the cathedral, standing in Jackson Square, gasping for breath in the humid New Orleans air. She could still hear the music faintly, emanating from the cathedral behind her, though she knew the building was locked and empty. The next day, she spoke with Father Pierre, the elderly priest who had served at St. Louis Cathedral for over 40 years. He listened to her story without interruption, his expression growing more concerned as she spoke. When she finished, he sighed deeply. Father Pierre told her that she wasn't the first organist to experience this.
Over the years, several musicians had reported similar phenomena. Some had quit immediately. Others, like Margaret, had tried to understand it. He explained that the cathedral had a long and complex history, and that Rousseau's death was just one of many strange incidents associated with the building. He warned her never to try to play along with the phantom melody again. He said that whatever Rousseau had tapped into with his music, it wasn't something that should be encouraged or explored.
It was best left alone, allowed to fade back into whatever realm it came from. Margaret continued to work at St. Louis Cathedral, but she changed her practice habits. She never stayed late alone anymore. She always made sure to leave before sunset. And when she played, she stuck to traditional hymns and well-known classical pieces. She avoided minor keys and low bass passages as much as possible. She told me that sometimes, during Mass, she can still hear it, a whisper of that otherworldly melody beneath the music she's playing. A reminder that the organ remembers Rousseau, remembers the music he created, and perhaps remembers other things too. Things from the cathedral's long and sometimes dark history. Now, if you think Margaret's experience with an organ is unsettling, wait until you hear about what happened to Daniel, a 36-year-old structural engineer from Boston. His work brought him to one of the oldest churches in America, the Old North Church, famous for the 1 if by land, 2 if by sea signal during Paul Revere's ride. But what Daniel discovered hidden in the church's structure shows that some secrets have been literally built into the walls, waiting for someone to find them. Daniel specializes in historic preservation. His company is hired to assess and repair old buildings, ensuring they can survive for future generations. In September 2019, he was contracted to evaluate the Old North Church in Boston's North End. The church, built in 1723, is a National Historic Landmark and needed careful assessment for necessary repairs. The work involved examining the church's brick walls, wooden beams, and foundation. Daniel and his team used modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and 3D scanning to create a complete picture of the building's structure without damaging it. It was the radar scan that revealed the anomaly. Behind a section of wall in the church's tower, there was a void, a space that shouldn't exist according to the original architectural plans. The void was small, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, located about 15 feet above the ground floor, in a section of the tower that appeared to be solid brick. Daniel informed the church's administration. After discussions with historians and preservationists, they decided to carefully create a small opening to investigate. The wall at that point was over 2 feet thick, solid brick laid by colonial craftsmen nearly 300 years ago. When they finally broke through, they found the void. It was a deliberately created cavity in the wall, sealed on all sides. Inside was a wooden box, surprisingly well preserved given the humid Boston climate. The box was locked with an iron mechanism, but the lock had rusted away enough that they could open it carefully. What they found inside was a collection of objects that made no sense in a Christian church. There were bones, small ones, possibly from animals or birds. There were pieces of metal inscribed with symbols that Daniel didn't recognize. There were scraps of paper with writing that appeared to be code or cipher. And there was a small book bound in what looked like human skin, though Daniel hoped it wasn't. The church administration immediately called in experts, historians, theologians, and even a consultant from a university who specialized in colonial-era occult practices. What they learned was fascinating and deeply disturbing. Colonial Boston had a dark side that few people today know about. While the Puritans are famous for the Salem witch trials, less well known are the secret societies and occult groups that existed in Boston during the 18th century. Some of these groups infiltrated the mainstream churches, hiding their true practices behind a facade of Christian devotion. The box Daniel found appeared to be a witch bottle or protective charm hidden in the wall during the church's construction. But the symbols and objects suggested it wasn't meant to protect against evil. It was meant to contain something, to keep it trapped within the church's walls.
The expert in colonial occultism was particularly interested in the book. He spent days carefully examining it, and what he found disturbed him greatly. The book was a grimoire, a book of spells and rituals written in English, Latin, and symbols from various occult traditions. But more than that, it was a diary. The writer, who signed himself only as J.M., described conducting rituals in the church, specifically in the tower where the box was found. He wrote about summoning spirits of the air and binding them to the church to serve some purpose he never fully explained. The last entry in the book was dated 1725, just 2 years after the church was built. After that entry, there was no further record of J.M. The expert speculated that whatever ritual he had been attempting had either succeeded in some terrible way or had failed catastrophically. Either way, the objects were sealed in the wall, perhaps by J.M. himself or by someone who discovered what he was doing. The church administration faced a dilemma. These objects were historically significant, but they were also potentially dangerous from a spiritual perspective. After consulting with the Cardinal of Boston, they decided to have the objects blessed and exorcised by a priest trained in such matters, and then donated to the Catholic Church's secret archives, where such objects are kept securely away from the public.
But before the objects were removed, strange things started happening in the church. Equipment malfunctions during worship services, lights flickering at odd times, visitors reporting feeling dizzy or anxious in the tower area. One elderly woman claimed she heard voices singing in a language she didn't recognize, coming from the walls themselves. Daniel himself experienced something he can't explain. One evening, after everyone else had left, he was taking final measurements in the tower. He suddenly felt intensely cold, despite it being summer in Boston. His breath formed clouds in the air, and he heard something. A whisper that seemed to come from the very walls, from the cavity they had opened. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry, or perhaps not angry, but aware and displeased that its hiding place had been discovered. Daniel packed up his equipment and left immediately. He finished his remaining work during daylight hours only, and he never went to the tower alone again. The objects were removed from the church in a closed ceremony, blessed and sealed in a special container, and taken away by representatives from the archdiocese. The hole in the wall was repaired, sealed with new brick and mortar blessed by the priest before installation. The church continues to operate normally, hosting services and tourists daily. But Daniel told me that sometimes when he drives past the Old North Church, he looks up at the tower and wonders what J.M. was really trying to do, wonders if sealing those objects in the wall was meant to protect the church or to protect the world from what was contained in the church. And he wonders if by opening that cavity, they released something that had been trapped for nearly 300 years. And to conclude these unsettling accounts, I want to share the testimony of Sister Catherine, a 71-year-old nun who has spent most of her adult life in a convent in rural Pennsylvania. Her story is different from the others because she didn't discover something hidden or long forgotten. She witnessed something that happens regularly, something that the sisters in her convent have all experienced but rarely discuss, even among themselves. Because sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't buried in the past, but manifest in the present in ways that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and what lies between. Sister Catherine has lived at the Convent of the Sacred Heart since 1975. It's a small community of contemplative nuns dedicated to prayer and silence. The convent is located in the countryside, surrounded by woods and fields, far from the nearest town. Life there follows a rhythm unchanged for centuries: prayer, work, meals, sleep, repeat. The convent has a chapel where the sisters gather 7 times a day for communal prayer. It's a simple space, with wooden benches, a plain altar, and a crucifix. The chapel is the heart of the convent, the place where the sisters feel closest to God. Sister Catherine noticed something unusual about the chapel early in her time at the convent, but it took her years to fully understand what she was seeing. During Matins, the first prayer of the day at 3 a.m., there was always one empty bench, always the same bench, second row on the right.
No matter how full or empty the chapel was, no sister ever sat in that spot. At first, Sister Catherine thought it was simply tradition. Perhaps the spot was reserved for the Mother Superior or some similar protocol. But the Mother Superior sat in the front row, and when Sister Catherine asked an older nun about it, the woman simply smiled and said, "That seat is occupied." Confused, Sister Catherine began to pay more attention during Matins, and slowly, over months of early morning prayers, she began to see what the older sisters meant. There was something in that empty seat. Not a person exactly, but a presence. A shadow that was slightly darker than the surrounding darkness. A form that suggested a kneeling figure, a nun in a habit, head bowed in prayer. The first time Sister Catherine fully saw her, she gasped audibly. Several other sisters turned to look at her, then back at the empty bench and nodded slightly, as if to say, "Yes, you see her now." After Matins that morning, Sister Catherine spoke with the Mother Superior, a woman of great wisdom and serenity. The Mother Superior led her to the convent's small archive room and showed her a journal from 1843. In it was an entry about Sister Mary Agnes, a young nun who had died of tuberculosis at the age of 24. Sister Mary Agnes had been known for her exceptional devotion to prayer. Even when she was dying, too weak to stand, she insisted on being helped to the chapel for Matins. She said that prayer was her life, and she couldn't bear to miss it. The night she died, the journal recorded, she passed away in her sleep. But the next morning, the sisters saw her in the chapel, in her usual spot, participating in Matins as she always had. And she has been there ever since. Every morning at 3 a.m., Sister Mary Agnes joins her community for prayer. She doesn't speak, doesn't move except to kneel and rise with the others, but she's there, faithful to her vows even in death. Sister Catherine asked if this frightened the other sisters. The Mother Superior smiled gently and said no. Sister Mary Agnes is not a ghost to be feared. She is a member of their community, a sister who was chosen to continue her life of prayer even after death. Her presence is a reminder of the eternal nature of devotion, of how some souls are so deeply committed to God that they transcend mortal limitations. Over the years, Sister Catherine has come to know Sister Mary Agnes well, in the strange way one can know a silent presence. She has learned to recognize the subtle signs of her presence, a slight chill in the air, a sense of peace that deepens during prayer, occasionally a faint scent of lilies, which was Sister Mary Agnes's favorite flower. And there have been times when Sister Mary Agnes has been more present than usual. When a sister is dying, Sister Mary Agnes appears more clearly, as if she's preparing to welcome her sister into whatever lies beyond. 3 times, Sister Catherine has seen a dying sister reach out toward the empty bench, smiling, as if she sees something the others can't see yet. The most remarkable incident occurred 5 years ago, when Sister Catherine herself was seriously ill. She had pneumonia and was being cared for in the convent's infirmary. One night, burning with fever, she thought she saw Sister Mary Agnes standing by her bed. The long-dead nun placed a cool hand on Sister Catherine's forehead, and Sister Catherine felt peace wash over her. The fever broke that night, and she began to recover. Sister Catherine told me that she no longer fears death. When her time comes, she knows Sister Mary Agnes will be there, in the chapel, praying for her soul's journey. And perhaps, she said with a smile, one day there will be 2 shadows in the chapel during Matins. 2 nuns who loved prayers so much that they continued to offer it to God even after their mortal lives ended. This story is perhaps the least frightening of the 4 I've shared, but it's the most profound. It reminds us that churches are liminal spaces, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. And sometimes in these spaces, we encounter mysteries that challenge our understanding of death, faith, and the eternal nature of devotion. Sister Mary Agnes is not trapped or suffering. She has chosen to remain, to continue her service, to demonstrate that true faith transcends even death itself.